Good morning, Ambassador Arif, Ambassador Sten, Ambassador Omage. Thank you very much for talking with the National. Today, our conversation will touch on understanding some of the factors, the role of natural resources, population, education, government investment, entrepreneurship, which over the years helped transform Canada, Norway, and Singapore into examples of growth and economic diversification. Ambassador Arif, Canada until the 19th century was a mostly resource-based economy. However, you wanted a broad-based economy with strength in banking, manufacturing, high technology, other services. And I believe Canada is considered to be the 11th largest economy. Can you briefly tell us how this evolution occurred?
Sure. If I had to give you about 6 or 7 points on how we've diversified, I think I would start with vision. You have to have a vision. So Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, in 1867 had a vision of transforming this country, which was based on natural resources, to becoming a modern industrialized economy. Very similar to His Highness Sheikh Zayed when the UAE was founded, to move from a resource-based economy. And we have very similar traditions, so Canada was built on the fur trade. And then in 1870, almost overnight it collapsed because of artificial fur. And the UAE was built on the pearl trade, and almost overnight it collapsed because of cultured pearls from Japan. Both of us then discovered oil. Both of us then started to settle our countries. Second is diversification. People think we're a resource-rich country, and we are, but 72% of our economy is actually from services. Tourism, education, financial sector, real estate, et cetera. So only 7% is now resource-based. So we have actually successfully diversified. A big part of it is being open to trade. We had 3 key trade agreements. In 1965, we had the Auto Pact between Canada and the US. And that made a huge difference because it allowed Canada to join the value chain of the automotive industry with the US. And attaching us to a huge market. Then we created the Free Trade Agreement in the 1980s and then expanded it to Mexico. But the Free Trade Agreement really helped us diversify our economy and gave us access. And now we've just signed a Free Trade Agreement with the European Union, ahead of the US, ahead of most others. And so this now allows us to open up even more.
Having the USA as a market right next door probably helped in further the growth of your economy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, being next to the U.S. is a huge advantage for us. To give you an example, we do $2 billion worth of trade every day with the U.S. Every day. That's the entire amount of trade we do with the UAE every year. So it gives you an importance. However, we're gradually decreasing our trade with the U.S. and diversifying to Asia and to the Middle East. So that really has helped us in diversifying our economy.
Fantastic. Ambassador Sten, Norway shares many similarities with the UAE. So both are blessed with oil. Can you share with us how oil helped diversify your economy?
I would say, first of all, you have to keep in perspective that the oil was the second or third natural resource base for Norway. We based our industrial development first on abundant resources of hydropower through our waterfalls. So the industrial development and economic development in Norway was already tuned to development of natural resources. So when we then found petroleum, we had a setup and we had a system for administering this, and I would say a couple of them guidelines, political guidelines that was crucial. One was keeping the national control. Second, that the natural resource is for the whole population, not for a few. And then thirdly, and maybe the most importantly, was keeping the powers of the petroleum economy under control, not letting it loose on a very limited Norwegian economy with only 4 million people. So controlling the strength, and this was the basis for our establishing our sovereign wealth fund, was if you want to take the petroleum money out of the economy and channeling it abroad so that we had control over the forces and didn't get an unnatural acceleration, so that we would have a sustainable setup all the time. Finally, I would say that we have used the North Sea and the offshore sector as a laboratory for developing new industries, so that the supplies, the mechanical equipment supplies to the offshore industry is now Norway's second largest economic sector. And this has been done on the back of the petroleum industry and using the offshore sector as a laboratory.
So, Ambassador, so on hydropower, so there's a realization that it's important to have sustainable power initially to develop your economy.
We were very lucky to have that. I mean, either you have waterfalls or you don't have waterfalls. There's a dissimilarity between the UAE and Norway. But we had this wealth of hydropower. Still today, all electricity in Norway is produced by hydropower. So all electricity in Norway is pollution-free. But then keeping the national ownership, only the nation are allowed to own Norwegian waterfalls, and only the nation are allowed to own Norwegian petroleum stocks.
So now there's a transformation. Now Norway, as you mentioned, has become a major energy center. So away from that dependence of just extraction of hydrocarbons.
I think it's a wide agreement that tomorrow's natural resource all over the world is going to be the brain. So development of education, innovation, technical knowledge. The petroleum sector has been used as a boost to develop this. The technical supplies to the oil sector are important, but on the back of that again now we are developing a medical industry, for example, and as everyone else, a computer industry. So the development of the petroleum sector and the needs of the petroleum sector have been developed with an eye to a wider market for the day that is not going to carry us anymore.
Ambassador Mage, Singapore, unlike everyone around this table, has not had the luxury of natural resources. And you also have a small population, so there's a couple of challenges there. But tell us, how have you managed to build out such a diversified economy?
As a country which doesn't have our oil and gas, we don't have barrels, but we have babies, people. And I think this in some ways is very germane to your timely initiative of economic diversification, because Singapore had to start with no natural resources. And we had, when we were independent in 1965, we didn't even want independence. It was foisted on us, and almost immediately we realized we don't have much. We have a port that we had from our colonial times, we had a shipyard, and we had a very young population. And these could either be assets or liabilities. We turned them into assets. By 1971, when the British pulled out completely from our region as part of their retreat east of Suez, we suddenly found that we had a lot more jobless youth. 20% of our employment was dependent on the British basis. And at that time, we had per capita GDP of $500. So we had to move very fast to industrialize, to absorb the unemployment, to create an economic base, and we didn't have a choice but to seize on any assets we had and to sort of minimize our liabilities. Now, in addition to achieving quick industrialization, we had to develop our people and had to be scaled up. We had survival-driven education in those days just to fill the jobs. In addition to that, to pick up on our assets, we had to do planning. We had to be very, very careful with long-term planning. We had to put together whatever strengths we had. Being a price taker in the global economy, not having natural resources, we had to look at planning to see how we could make the most of our industries, to see how we could leverage on our location. The fact that Singapore is a port city with trade 4 times our GDP between South China Sea and Indian Ocean, we had to leverage on this as well. And we had agencies like the Economic Development Board who tried to look at key verticals of growth to see how could Singapore power ahead. So today, even though we don't have any naturally produced barrels of oil or gas, we're the swing oil refiner for Asia. We produce 70% of the world's jack-up oil rigs. We do 25% of physical oil commodities trading. So once again, where we found that we had possible liabilities, we said, how can we turn them into assets? And I think that's more or less the story of our success.
Yeah, and we've done the same thing. So Canadians can work in the US without having to become citizens. I mean, there are special categories, and the same for Americans who can come to Canada and work.
Singapore ambassador, any similar sort of labor movement in the Asian markets?
Well, I think firstly, Singapore, very similar to Canada in the sense that we are largely immigrant societies. And in terms of our population, we're much smaller. Our local population of Singaporeans is about 3.2 million. We have another million who hold permanent residency, who are foreigners, and another 1.5 million labor. And I think we're always looking for what we call foreign talent. We're looking to infuse our economic base with skills from the outside. And the unique hallmark of Singapore is if you are someone from the outside and you come in and you have skills and something to contribute, you become part of the Singapore social fabric. I mean, we have people who get citizenship and within a year or two, they could be a member of parliament, or they could be a senior office holder. So it's that openness which is very important. And in terms of our local ASEAN market and the region, we have people from all over the region working in Singapore. I mean, a lot of Malaysians, sort of Thais. I mean, if you look at the border crossing between Malaysia and Singapore every morning and every evening, it's testament to the kind of openness that we have. And you can't but be open because our trade is 4 times our GDP. We're the original, if you like to call it that, global city-state. And as an open global city-state, you have to be open to people, to ideas, and to economic currents. So I think that's a key part of Singapore's orientation.
Now let's look at education, knowing that it is a long-term enterprise. So there's a challenge of timing, nurturing talent, education, and then there's the needs of developing the industries and diversifying the economy.
Education is key to diversification. A couple of facts on Canada. We are, by OECD metrics, the most highly educated population in terms of the percentage of our citizens who have university or tertiary education.
Yeah.
So it's important to provide skills and know-how. But even more important than university education is vocational training. You know, at the end of the day, if your economy is booming, as it is here in the UAE, you've got construction, infrastructure, services, you actually need people who can do that work, you know, the engineering, the plumbing, the real skills and craftsmanship. So we created another level of institutions called vocational institutions. So the British Columbia Institute of Technology is one, Algonquin College is another, and in fact, the UAE colleges of higher education are based on the Canadian model back about 20 years ago. To find ways to get skilled labor force. So that's very important. Third for us is education is actually one of our biggest exports. So every time we take in foreign students, that's technically an export of services because they're coming in and buying our educational services. Or if we have schools and campuses overseas. So we do a lot of executive training here in the UAE. We have schools here, the Canadian Grammar School, the Canadian University of Dubai, and other institutions which use the Canadian system which is really an export of our know-how. So I think education is really important, and you have to have, as you say, a long-term commitment to it.
We have a challenge. We have a constant undersupply of engineers. Based on what I've said earlier, it's kind of obvious, but we do, and to channel enough or making enough young people want to study engineering, want to go for sciences. I mean, math among younger people is not a particularly popular subject, so we're struggling to forward that and to forward the basic natural science skills and make young people choose the topics that the industry needs. Here I think we really do have something in common with the United Arab Emirates. We have a common challenge with a limited population. So of course there we have to rely on imports to a certain extent. The level, I mean, the amount of people going through school is good enough, but then to keep the quality up and keep up with the times and so on. So I would say for any Norwegian government, we have just changed, but the one thing the previous government and this government have in common is that they have education on the top of their agenda. So it's absolutely crucial.
The Singaporean project, and there's a lot of focus on education and offering training to all the different levels, from blue collar all the way to the high level professionals.
There's a saying in Singapore, it takes 1 year to grow a plant, 10 years to grow a tree, and 100 years to grow a man. You know, education is a long-term project, and Singapore hasn't had the luxury of having a long sort of development trajectory. We needed to get things done fast, and it was a challenge. We see education as human capital investment. But when we started off, and we haven't been around for a very long time, just 50 years, we needed to make sure our education system was geared to whatever our industry needed at that time. And what is actually very, very, very important is there's this constant dialogue between our government and industry leaders to say, what do you need? What sort of skills do you need? And we plan ahead of time. We plan to the extent that we need to know how many doctors, how many lawyers does the workforce need? And then we'll say, well, there are these number of places that we'll have in our local universities. Or even if you go to a foreign university, there are only these number of professional lawyers we will allow back. So it's a question of really planning things very carefully to make sure we don't end up with more humanities graduates than, let's say, people with professional degrees or what they call STEM education. So it's about planning, it's about taking a very pragmatic view, but also deciding what does the economy need. I completely echo what my colleague Arif mentioned about the importance of vocational education, and this has been a hallmark for Singapore. If you don't, like Canada, we have probably one of the highest proportion of Singaporeans in our region, Asians, doing tertiary education. But for those who don't make the cut, it's not just about going and doing a humanities degree just for the credentials. It's about saying, look, go out and do a vocational program, and then make sure that you then plug into the local economy. So in a way, it's a kind of plug and play. You can't do that, do something else so that you can contribute to the economy. As I said, it's very pragmatic, it's very functional, and it's about making sure that our economic growth keeps up. The challenge, though, if I may just say, is that today there are changing expectations among the younger people. They want to focus on other things, on more intangibles. And it's how do you balance between educating for skills and educating to form people, to give them a broader education, and that's something we're grappling with right now.
Isn't there a challenge, though? You are planning for your economies, but the youth or people have inclinations. They might favor a certain topic over another, or a job over another, but might not have that perhaps tied in with the country's plan.
Well, it's an interesting point. I mean, in Canada, we take a slightly different approach. I mean, we don't plan as much. The government sector doesn't get involved in that. Our approach is more to create the opportunity and let people choose. It's a little bit riskier, but it's also the function of the kind of open government and democratic society that we have, which is to create an array of opportunities, to do our homework in terms of the government does look at what is the need, and then we create opportunities. So we create the BC Institute of Technology, we create vocational institutes, we also support universities. But you're quite right, at the end of the day, the people have to make a choice about what they're going to do. So far we've been lucky, and we can compensate for that where we can make choices is in immigration.
Yes.
And there we very carefully target what are the labor needs, what are the skills needs for Canada, and recruit those immigrants.
If we allow the free market to reign completely, people might go for the easiest choice. It might not necessarily be the best choice for them, for their future, or for the country's future. And on top of that, let's say we decide, you make a choice, you make a bad choice, and then down the road you want to have continuing education and training. Then that way that's a second phase where we can bring you in and say, okay, we've got certain targets, pharmaceuticals, logistics, aerospace, and that's where we're building up our industries. And if you want to have a second bite, the cherry, and have training later on down the road, we can funnel you into that, or into nursing, or into becoming a teacher. So it's a continuing process. It's not just one doorway, and then down the road, I think this is a new paradigm of education.
Singapore has done very successfully what Abu Dhabi plans to do, which is build niche industries led by government investments. Can you tell us how Singapore goes about this?
Okay, firstly, I will say that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. I mean, the lessons, the trajectory of development that Singapore adopted may or may not be relevant to Abu Dhabi or the UAE. It's really very different circumstances, different contexts. The most we can provide is not a model as such, but just some lessons. Just adumbrate a basic point of view of how, a perspective of how we achieved our development. But I would say the first thing is planning. Planning is key. You need to have an idea of where you're going. And it's got to be not a short-term structuralism, but a long-term planning. That's been our experience. We need to have a knowledge economy to make sure that we have Singaporeans who are able to plug into anywhere in the global knowledge economy. We have a fantastic agency, it's called the Economic Development Board, that's played an important role as a one-stop investor agency for Singapore for a long time. And they look at key industries, key sectors, and say, look, this is where we need to invest, this is where we need to attract investment, and then this is what we're going to do. And if it no longer becomes relevant, they'll say, let's go to the next step.
Singapore established a couple of sovereign wealth funds.
Yeah.
What role do they have in developing the local economy?
Well, we have two major sovereign wealth funds. We have our Government Investment Corporation, GIC, and we have Temasek. The GIC is about ensuring our foreign exchange, our foreign reserves rather, I beg your pardon, our foreign reserves are maintained for future generations of Singaporeans, that we invest in them and that pile grows. Temasek has a slightly different risk-return sort of orientation, and it's a holding company for a lot of our government-linked corporations. In terms of economic diversification, I have to make it clear that the decisions made by our sovereign wealth funds are purely commercial ones. They were hived off from our Ministry of Finance many years ago, and the Singapore government does not interfere, even though they're a key shareholder, it does not interfere in the commercial decisions. So economic diversification programs for the government are done separately from whatever our sovereign wealth funds do.
But all right, is there though communication between those two entities?
No, I mean they operate completely separately. They have very different mandates because Temasek Holding is an investment company, and they have a diverse portfolio that spans a number of industries.
Our province of Alberta, which is the biggest part of our oil industry, has a sovereign wealth fund of sorts. So it functions similarly very independent from the government and makes commercial investments. And it is designed, as in Norway, to be a buffer. It initially started by being called a rainy day fund, and it was designed entirely to ensure that the taxpayers were taken care of if the economy suffered. But we have a couple of other funds which I think would be interesting here to the UAE. So we have two. One is called the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, and it's run by the government, and it's really designed to help the Atlantic maritime part of Canada to develop economically, because it didn't have the resources at the beginning. And so it creates and funds innovation. It tries to fund new business ventures, new enterprises. Similarly, for Western Canada, we have something called the Western Canada Economic Diversification Fund, which tries to do the same thing on the west side of the country. And it's not, I think, unlike what you're trying to do here in some of the other emirates in trying to promote different industries, different clusters, different sectors.
I have just the last point on entrepreneurship and building an environment that encourages small businesses that would contribute to the local economy.
You have to have an economy that allows businesses to grow. And here, Canadians are actually quite proud of what we've done. And you see then that Canada, like Norway and Singapore, are really part of this very open global chain in which if you have ideas and you want to be an entrepreneur, or if you want to make investments, then Canada is the easiest place for you to do it.
To nurture entrepreneurs is like nurture good sports people, football players. You have to find the talent when they're young. You have to give them nurturing, but then you also have, as the Canadian ambassador says, you have to subject them to competition, because if not, they will have a biased look at the world. So Norway, we are not quite as open as Singapore, but about half our GDP is imported and exported. So openness, open competition has been the name of the game always, and also has been a crucial part of developing the petroleum supply industries. Mentioned at the same time, I mean, we have developed over the last 30 years another major, really major industry, namely the fish farming industry. And on the same basis that we found talent, we have given them the basis for doing it, and then we have subjected them to the harshest international competition that they have to withstand. And then the last point, which I want to reiterate, is the neighborhoodliness, the cooperation locally, and the inspiring your neighbors and nurturing new ideas.
We know that the economic center of gravity is going east towards my region, and Singapore is locationally well positioned to take advantage of that shift. And if you think about it, Singapore year after year is really tops the charts when it comes to ease of doing business on any scale in terms of getting things done. Our government agencies make it our business to get business done easily, because we don't have a choice. Now, if you're a young Emirati today and you want to get a bite of that big business that's going on in the East, come to Singapore, because Singapore is China made easy, it's East Asia made easy. It's a great starting launch pad for any young Emirati who wants to understand where the future center of gravity is, where the future business is going to be. Singapore is a great place to do it.
Well, Ambassador Umaid, Ambassador Sten, Ambassador Arif, thank you very much for giving us some of your time and for talking with the National.
Thank you. Thanks for doing it.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.